The steam rose from the busy kitchen of the Golden Palace restaurant, where pots clattered and chefs called out orders in rapid succession. In the back corner, near the industrial dishwasher, stood 12-year-old Raj, his small hands working quickly to clean the endless stream of plates that came his way. His white apron, though washed daily by his mother, bore the battle scars of tomato sauce and cooking oil from his after-school shifts. Working at such a fancy place wasn't easy for a kid his age, but Raj knew every penny he earned helped his mom keep their tiny apartment. She worked 2 jobs already, and her tired smile each morning only made him more determined to help. The restaurant owner had hired him out of kindness, knowing their situation after Raj's father passed away 3 years ago. That evening started like any other. The dining room buzzed with the city's elite. Business people in expensive suits, ladies with sparkling jewelry, and waiters gliding between tables with plates that cost more than Raj's weekly salary. He kept his head down, focusing on his work, occasionally peeking through the kitchen's swinging doors to watch the fancy world beyond. But something caught his eye as Chef Wong prepared a special mushroom dish. Raj noticed the distinctive cap pattern on the mushrooms being sliced. His heart skipped a beat. These looked exactly like the ones his mother had pointed out in her nature guidebook. You see, despite their tight budget, his mom had never lost her passion for studying wild plants and mushrooms. She'd spent years learning about them, dreaming of becoming a researcher someday. Remember, Betta, she'd say during their weekend nature walks, some of the most beautiful mushrooms can be the most dangerous. Always pay attention to the details. Through the kitchen window, Raj could see the dish's destination, Table 7, where Mr. Kumar, one of the city's biggest business tycoons, sat with his associates. Everyone knew about Mr. Kumar. His face was often in the newspapers, and his companies employed half the people in their neighborhood. What caught Raj's attention wasn't the man's expensive watch or his perfectly tailored suit. It was the medical alert bracelet that glinted on his wrist. Raj's hands trembled as he set down the plate he was washing. His mother's words echoed in his head, warning about this specific type of mushroom and its effects on people with certain health conditions. He'd seen that same warning symbol on Mr. Kumar's bracelet in his mother's medical books. The boy's heart raced. Should he speak up? Who would believe a dishwasher boy anyway? He could lose his job, and they desperately needed the money. But if he was right about the mushrooms... Through the steam and noise of the kitchen, Raj watched as the beautifully plated dish made its way toward Table 7. His feet felt heavy, but his conscience felt heavier. Taking a deep breath, he wiped his hands on his apron and pushed through the kitchen doors. The elegant dining room suddenly felt a million miles long, and every step toward Mr. Kumar's table seemed to echo in his ears. He could feel the stares. A busboy whispered something to a waiter. A lady at a nearby table pulled her designer purse closer. But Raj kept walking, his mother's teachings giving him courage. Sometimes doing the right thing meant being brave, even when everyone else thought you were wrong. The dish was being set down just as Raj reached the table. Mr. Kumar looked up, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the small, disheveled boy in a stained apron approaching his table. The businessmen around him stopped their conversation, and the waiter froze mid-service. Raj's throat felt dry, but he knew he had to speak. His whole future, and maybe someone else's life, hung on what he would say next. The dining room fell silent as Raj stood before Mr. Kumar's table, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his apron. The crystal chandeliers seemed to sparkle a bit too brightly, and the soft classical music playing in the background felt suddenly distant. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the small boy who dared to disturb one of the city's most important businessmen. "Sir," Raj's voice came out barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, please don't eat that dish." His heart was pounding so hard, he was sure everyone could hear it. Mr. Kumar set down his fork, which had been halfway to his mouth. His expression wasn't angry, just surprised and slightly curious. The same couldn't be said for his dining companions. One man in a navy suit scoffed, while another began waving for security. "Young man," Mr. Kumar spoke calmly, his deep voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "Do you work here?" "Yes, sir. In the kitchen. I wash dishes after school," Raj replied, standing a bit straighter despite his trembling knees. He could see Chef Wong storming out of the kitchen, his face red with anger. The restaurant manager, Mr. Patel, was hurrying over, profusely apologizing. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Kumar. This boy is new. He doesn't understand." Mr. Patel began, but Mr. Kumar raised his hand, silencing him. "Let the boy speak," Mr. Kumar said, his eyes never leaving Raj's face. There was something in the businessman's expression, a hint of kindness, perhaps, that gave Raj courage. "The mushrooms in your dish, sir," Raj continued, his voice growing stronger. "They look exactly like the ones my mother taught me about. She studies plants and mushrooms, you see. She showed me in her books that these particular ones can be dangerous for people with." He gestured carefully toward Mr. Kumar's wrist, where the medical alert bracelet caught the light. The dining room erupted in murmurs. Chef Wong's face turned from red to white. "Impossible," he exclaimed. "These are premium-grade Matsutake mushrooms, imported specially for Mr. Kumar." One of Mr. Kumar's associates leaned forward, his tone dismissive. "This is ridiculous. You're going to listen to a dishwasher boy about fine cuisine." But Mr. Kumar remained quiet, studying Raj thoughtfully. "Your mother studies mushrooms?" he asked, genuine interest in his voice. "Yes, sir. She wanted to be a researcher, but—" Raj hesitated, not wanting to mention their financial struggles. "She reads everything she can about them. Takes pictures when we go for walks in the park. She taught me how to identify different types, especially the dangerous ones." A well-dressed woman at the next table sniffed disapprovingly. "This is preposterous. The boy probably just wants attention, or money." Raj felt his cheeks burn with shame, but he stood his ground. "No, ma'am. I couldn't let someone get sick if I could prevent it. My mother always says knowledge isn't worth anything if you don't use it to help others." Mr. Kumar smiled slightly at this, then turned to his personal assistant. "Ms. Lee, would you mind making a quick call to Dr. Gupta? Ask him about these specific mushrooms and their interaction with my condition." The restaurant held its breath as Ms. Lee stepped away to make the call. Raj could feel Chef Wong's glare burning into his back, and he knew his job was probably already gone. His mother would be so disappointed, not about him losing the job, but about him causing trouble. Yet somehow, looking at that medical alert bracelet, he knew he had done the right thing. Mr. Patel was wringing his hands nervously. Other diners were whispering among themselves, and Raj stood there, feeling smaller by the second, but refusing to back down. His mother had taught him that truth and kindness were more important than anything else. Even if nobody believed him, even if he lost his job, he knew he had to try to prevent what could be a terrible mistake. The tension in the restaurant could be cut with a knife as Ms. Lee returned to the table, her phone still in hand. Her expression had changed completely, the earlier annoyance replaced with concern. She leaned down to whisper something in Mr. Kumar's ear, and his eyes widened slightly. "Chef Wong," Mr. Kumar called out, his voice steady but serious. "Could you please tell me exactly which type of mushrooms you used in this dish?" The chef stepped forward, his confidence returning. "Of course, sir. These are premium Matsutake mushrooms, as I mentioned. They look similar to the common pine mushroom, but are far more exclusive. I personally selected them from our finest supplier." Raj gathered his courage and spoke up again. "Sir, if I may, the pattern on the cap is different from Matsutake. These have a more web-like design, and the stem has a slightly greenish tint at the base. My mother showed me how Matsutake mushrooms have a cleaner, whiter pattern." The other diners watched in amazement as this young dishwasher boy spoke with such knowledge about fine ingredients. Chef Wong's face began to show the first signs of doubt. Mr. Kumar turned to Ms. Lee. What did Dr. Gupta say exactly? Sir, he confirmed that people with your specific condition should never consume this particular variety of mushroom. He said it could trigger a severe reaction within minutes. He's actually quite concerned and suggested we document which supplier provided these mushrooms. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted dramatically. What had seemed like an impertinent interruption by a poor boy was suddenly becoming something much more serious. Chef Wong hurried back to the kitchen, presumably to check his ingredients more carefully. Mr. Kumar's business associates, who had been so dismissive earlier, now sat in uncomfortable silence. The woman who had accused Raj of seeking attention suddenly became very interested in her napkin. "Young man," Mr. Kumar said, turning back to Raj, "you said your mother taught you about mushrooms. Tell me more about what she knows." Raj's eyes lit up at the chance to talk about his mother. "She's amazing, sir. Even though we don't have much money, she spends every free moment studying. She has notebooks filled with drawings and information about different plants and mushrooms. She can identify hundreds of species just by looking at them. Sometimes she even helps our neighbors figure out which wild plants are safe to eat." Chef Wong returned, his face pale. He was holding a container and a reference guide. "Mr. Kumar, I need to apologize. The boy is right. These aren't Matsutake mushrooms. Our supplier made a terrible mistake. They're a similar-looking variety, but—" His voice trailed off. The restaurant manager looked like he might faint. "Mr. Kumar, please, we had no idea. This has never happened before in our establishment." But Mr. Kumar wasn't listening to them. He was watching Raj with increasing interest. "What's your mother's name, young man?" "Mrs. Mehra, sir. She works at the pharmacy during the day and cleans offices at night. But she spends every spare minute with her books and research. A scientist at heart, working 2 jobs to make ends meet," Mr. Kumar mused, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to Ms. Lee again. "Didn't we just approve funding for that new research program at the Botanical Institute?" The entire restaurant watched this exchange, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Here was this small boy in his stained apron, who had dared to trust his mother's teachings enough to risk everything, standing before one of the most powerful men in the city, and instead of being angry about the interruption, Mr. Kumar seemed genuinely intrigued by both the boy's courage and his mother's hidden expertise. The next few minutes in the Golden Palace restaurant were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The initial chaos had turned into a buzz of excited whispers as guests pulled out their phones, some already typing away about the extraordinary events they were witnessing. The story of a dishwasher boy potentially saving a business tycoon's life was too incredible not to share. Chef Wong had retreated to the kitchen to begin a thorough inspection of all their ingredients, while Mr. Patel, the restaurant manager, was on the phone with their supplier, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. The supplier would have serious questions to answer about their quality control procedures. Meanwhile, Mr. Kumar remained remarkably calm. He pushed aside the untouched plate and gestured for Raj to take a seat at their table, something that made several of his business associates raise their eyebrows in surprise. "Tell me more about these weekend nature walks with your mother," Mr. Kumar said, genuinely interested. "Where do you usually go?" Raj, still standing because he felt too nervous to sit at such a fancy table, fidgeted with his apron. "We go to the city park, sir. Sometimes, when we can save enough bus fare, we visit the forest on the outskirts of town. Mother says you can learn something new every time you look at nature carefully." A waiter hurriedly brought Raj a glass of water, probably the first time they'd ever served a dishwasher boy in the main dining room. Raj took a small sip, his hands still shaking slightly. "And your mother does all this research while working 2 jobs?" Mr. Kumar asked, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, sir. She's very tired sometimes, but she never complains. She says knowledge is like a seed. It needs time and patience to grow." Raj's voice filled with pride as he talked about his mother. She keeps all her notes in old notebooks she gets from the discount store. Sometimes she even presses plants between the pages to study them better. Ms. Lee, who had been quietly taking notes on her tablet, looked up. Mr. Kumar, I've just received Dr. Gupta's detailed email. He says this type of mushroom identification could have prevented several hospitalizations last year. Apparently, there's been a rise in rare mushroom varieties being misidentified in high-end restaurants. The business associates who had been so dismissive earlier were now leaning forward, interested. One of them, adjusting his expensive tie, cleared his throat. Kumar, isn't your foundation looking into food safety initiatives? Mr. Kumar nodded slowly, his eyes still on Raj. Young man, what does your mother do with all her research? She dreams of publishing it someday, sir. She wants to help people understand plants better, especially which ones are safe and which aren't. But, Raj hesitated, then continued honestly, getting proper education is expensive, and we barely manage our rent sometimes. The other diners had gone quiet again, many of them seemingly touched by the boy's simple but powerful words. Even the lady who had accused him of seeking attention earlier was now dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Mr. Kumar turned to Ms. Lee. Cancel my next appointment. And please ask Mrs. Mehra if she can join us here. I think we have something important to discuss. Then, looking back at Raj, he added warmly, your mother's knowledge, combined with your courage to speak up, may have just prevented a serious accident. That kind of dedication to doing what's right, despite the consequences, is rare. The restaurant's atmosphere had completely transformed. What had started as a potential disaster was turning into something entirely different. Raj stood there, still in his wet apron with dishwater stains, but somehow he seemed taller than before. He had done what his mother had always taught him, to stand up for what was right and to use knowledge to help others, no matter how scary it might be. 40 minutes later, Mrs. Mehra rushed into the Golden Palace restaurant, still wearing her pharmacy uniform, her hair slightly disheveled from her hurried journey. Her eyes were wide with worry as she scanned the room for her son. When she spotted Raj standing near Mr. Kumar's table, her expression shifted from concern to confusion. Mama, Raj called out, his face brightening. The other diners watched as this tired-looking woman in a simple uniform made her way through the elegant restaurant, her worn shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Mr. Kumar stood up politely. Mrs. Mehra, please join us. Your son has just prevented what could have been a very serious situation. He pulled out a chair for her, but she hesitated, looking uncertain. I'm so sorry if my boy has caused any trouble, she began, her voice soft but dignified. Whatever he has done, I'll make sure. Trouble. Mr. Kumar smiled warmly. On the contrary, your son's knowledge about mushrooms, knowledge that you taught him, just saved me from a potentially dangerous allergic reaction. He gestured to the seat again, and this time she sat down, though she still looked bewildered. As Ms. Lee explained the situation, Mrs. Mehra's eyes grew wide. She reached for Raj's hand, squeezing it tightly. You remember about the cap pattern? She whispered to him, pride evident in her voice. Just like you showed me in your books, Mama, Raj beamed. Mr. Kumar watched this exchange with interest. Mrs. Mehra, your son tells me you're quite knowledgeable about plants and mushrooms. That you study them whenever you can. She blushed slightly. It's just a hobby, sir. Something I've loved since I was a girl. I always wanted to study botany properly, but she glanced down at her worn uniform, her voice trailing off. Show in your notebook, Mama, Raj encouraged. The one you always carry. With slightly trembling hands, Mrs. Mehra pulled out a tattered notebook from her large shoulder bag. Its pages were stuffed with pressed leaves and careful drawings. Mr. Kumar gently took it and began flipping through the pages, his eyebrows rising with each turn. These illustrations are remarkably detailed, he commented, studying a page filled with precise drawings of different mushroom varieties. And these notes about their properties. This is university-level work. The restaurant had grown quiet again, everyone straining to hear the conversation. Mrs. Mara's face flushed with both pride and embarrassment. I read whatever books I can find at the library. Sometimes I use Raj's school computer to research online when I pick him up. The librarians are kind enough to let me make photocopies of scientific journals when they can. Mr. Kumar turned to Ms. Lee. Do you see what I mean? This is exactly the kind of dedication we've been looking for. Then, addressing Mrs. Mara directly, we're currently setting up a new research department at the Botanical Institute. We need people who have both knowledge and passion. People who understand the practical importance of this work. Mrs. Mara's eyes widened as she began to understand what he was suggesting. But sir, I don't have proper qualifications. No degree. What you have is something better, Mr. Kumar replied firmly. You have real-world experience and dedication. You've pursued this knowledge despite every obstacle. And thanks to what you've taught your son, you've already proven the practical value of your expertise. Raj watched his mother's face, seeing hope begin to replace exhaustion in her eyes. The woman who had worked so hard, who had never given up on her dreams, even while working 2 jobs to keep them afloat, was finally getting her chance. The news spread through the Golden Palace restaurant like wildfire. Waiters who had been nervously hovering at the edges of the dining room now whispered to their other customers about what was unfolding. The story seemed to touch something deep in everyone who heard it. A reminder that sometimes life's biggest moments come when you least expect them. The lady who had earlier accused Raj of seeking attention was now openly wiping tears from her eyes. She stood up from her table and approached Mr. Kumar's group. "Excuse me," she said softly, her earlier haughtiness completely gone. I want to apologize to the boy and his mother. We were so quick to judge, and yet," she turned to Raj, "you showed more wisdom than all of us put together." Other diners began to gather around too, drawn by the powerful story unfolding before them. One elderly gentleman spoke up. My own mother was a gardener. Never had formal education, but she knew every plant in our village. Sometimes the deepest knowledge comes from passion, not just degrees. Mr. Kumar nodded in agreement. Exactly why our research program needs people like Mrs. Mara. Real-world experience combined with dedication. That's what makes the difference. He turned back to Mrs. Mara, who was still trying to process everything happening around her. We'll provide all the formal training you need. But what you already have, this detailed knowledge, this careful observation, this commitment to learning despite all obstacles, that's something that can't be taught. Raj watched his mother's face, seeing years of hidden dreams beginning to surface. He remembered all those nights she'd spent studying after her long workdays, how she'd never complained about being tired, how she'd always made time to teach him about the natural world. Chef Wong, who had been quietly standing nearby, stepped forward. "Mrs. Mara, could I possibly look at your notebook too? In all my years of cooking, I've never seen someone with such detailed knowledge of mushroom varieties." His earlier anger had been replaced by genuine professional interest. As Mrs. Mara shyly showed him her careful drawings and notes, Mr. Kumar continued discussing plans with Ms. Lee. "We'll need to set up proper funding for education, a living stipend during training." He paused, looking at Raj. "And of course, we must ensure young Raj here can continue his studies without worrying about working after school." The boy's eyes widened. "But sir, what about the dishes? Who will help in the kitchen?" Mr. Patel, the restaurant manager, who had been nervously watching everything unfold, suddenly spoke up. Perhaps we could start a proper youth training program for students interested in the restaurant business, with proper hours and education support." He looked at Mr. Kumar hopefully. "An excellent idea," Mr. Kumar smiled. "Learning should open doors, not close them. And speaking of learning," he turned back to Mrs. Mara, Your research notes about these mushroom varieties could be invaluable for restaurants across the city. Would you be interested in developing a safety training program as part of your work?" Mrs. Mara's hands trembled as she closed her precious notebook. "Sir, this all seems like a dream. We've struggled for so long, and now—" "Now," Mr. Kumar said gently, "your years of dedication are being recognized. Your son's courage in speaking up showed us something we might have otherwise missed. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are right in front of us if we just take the time to notice." The other diners murmured in agreement. Many were already sharing the story on their phones, spreading the word about how a young dishwasher boy's knowledge and bravery had not only prevented a serious accident, but it also changed lives in unexpected ways. 6 months later, the Golden Palace restaurant looked very different on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. New educational posters about mushroom varieties lined the hallway leading to the kitchen, each one featuring detailed illustrations that seemed familiar to anyone who knew the story. In the corner of each poster was a small credit. From the research of Mrs. Mara, head researcher, Kumar Institute of Botanical Studies. The kitchen doors swung open, and Raj walked through, not in his old stained apron, but wearing a neat uniform with a badge that read Student Mentor. He was leading a group of young students, all part of the restaurant's new youth education program. "And this," he explained to the wide-eyed students, "is where I used to wash dishes. But more importantly, it's where I learned that speaking up for what's right matters more than being afraid of what people might think." The students listened intently. They'd all heard the story, of course. It had spread far beyond the restaurant, inspiring other businesses to look more closely at the hidden talents of their workers. Some had even started their own education support programs. In her new office at the Botanical Institute across town, Mrs. Mara was just finishing a presentation to an international group of food safety experts. Her detailed research on local mushroom varieties had already helped create new guidelines for restaurants across the city. The worn notebook that had once held her dreams now sat proudly displayed in a glass case in the Institute's lobby, inspiring other passionate learners who might lack formal education. Back at the restaurant, Mr. Kumar himself walked in for his regular lunch meeting. These days, he always requested a special table, the same one where months ago, a young dishwasher boy had dared to interrupt his meal. The story had changed him too. He now took more time to talk with his employees, believing that wisdom could come from unexpected places. "How are the new students doing?" he asked Raj, who was helping set up his table. "Very well, sir. They're eager to learn, just like I was. And now, they know they can dream bigger." Raj smiled, remembering how his own life had changed. He still helped at the restaurant a few hours a week, but now it was to teach others, while having plenty of time for his studies. Chef Wong, who had once been so angry at the interruption, now regularly consulted with Mrs. Mara about his ingredients. He even started teaching a class on mushroom identification himself, determined never to make the same mistake again. The lady who had accused Raj of seeking attention became one of the restaurant's most loyal customers. She made a point of talking to each new student in the program, encouraging them to speak up when they saw something wrong. As Mr. Kumar settled at his table, he noticed a new family walking into the restaurant, looking a bit unsure of the fancy surroundings. Their young daughter clutched a worn book about plants, much like Mrs. Mara once did with her notebook. He smiled, catching Raj's eye. "Should we tell them the story?" Raj asked, knowing the answer. "Of course," Mr. Kumar replied. "Every new person who hears it is reminded that opportunities can grow from the smallest acts of courage. Your mother showed us that knowledge gained from passion is just as valuable as any degree. And you showed us that doing the right thing, even when it's scary, can change not just one life, but many." The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important ingredients in life aren't found on any menu: courage, kindness, and the willingness to see the potential in others. As new customers continued to stream in, Each one would learn about the dishwasher boy who dared to speak up, the mother who never stopped learning, and the businessman who took the time to listen.